Please welcome the panel on Balance Sheet, the U.S. Government Budget and National Debt, moderated by writer and podcast host Josh Barro.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. It's kind of a funny time to be doing this panel. We were discussing when we were preparing for it. You're seeing it all over this conference. It's a little bit difficult to see 2 or 3 months in the future right now. We're going to look 25 or 50 years into the future on this panel. And we're going to try to set that frame so we can get that look into the future and a look at what we can do at a serious and persistent problem in the United States, which is our large federal debt, persistently high budget deficits, and budget deficits that may be set to increase before they can decrease. To have that conversation, I have with me today Maya MacGuineas, who runs the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget in Washington, D.C., Steven Mnuchin, of course, the former Treasury Secretary, also founder and managing partner at Liberty Strategic Capital, Paul Ryan, former Speaker of the House of Representatives, also Budget Committee Chairman prior to that, Alan Schwartz, who is the executive chairman at Guggenheim Partners, and finally Phillip Swagel, who directs the Congressional Budget Office. And so, Phil, I'd like to start here with you to scope what is this problem that we're looking at. A couple of times a year, your office puts out projections for the next 10 years, projecting a budget deficit of just over 6% of GDP for this year, also just over 6% of GDP 10 years from now. But that's a projection that comes before a lot of things that we know are coming down the pike. There's going to be a reconciliation bill that Congress will pass that's likely to grow the budget deficit. Your projections are based on 1.9% economic growth this year. I don't think we're likely to see that. There have been significant headcount cuts at the IRS, which could impact collections. And then, of course, there have been the tariffs and the changes to interest rates as a result of the tariffs. And so when you add all of that together, can you help give us a little bit of a picture of what we're actually looking at in terms of budget deficits that are likely to come in the next few years?
Okay. It can get scary quickly. We'll do our next budget update in sometime over the summer, but adding up and so just taking that scenario, right, the extension of the 2017 Act, the expiring provisions, that's about 1 percentage point of GDP. If the volatility that we've seen over the last couple of weeks knocks a percentage point off of GDP growth, well, that so just gives you another percent, sort of smoothing out the nonlinearity there. So you can start looking at budget deficits of 8% now, and then if GDP growth remains weak, if that's persistent, it can get much, much higher. Can I just say one more word, which is on the positive side? On the other hand, right, the administration is very focused on stronger growth. And, we have a pretty modest growth path. And if they are successful over time, that would help go in the other direction.
Right, that growth path, it's basically 2% real growth long run, is that right?
That's right. And it says we have a balancing out of slower demographics, and then that's holding down GDP growth, but then productivity growth is rebounding somewhat from kind of the weak productivity growth of the past decade.
Secretary Mnuchin, we had your successor, Scott Bessent, here this morning, who said, among other things, that he's hopeful that we will be back to 3% real growth about a year from now, and that he's hoping to reduce the budget deficit by about a percentage point a year. Do you see a path in that direction from the policy that we're seeing from the new administration? What's the case that we're actually going to be looking at shrinking budget deficits and more robust growth than the CBO might predict in the long run?
I'd say that's definitely a potential path. I think there's a lot of uncertainty over certain issues at the moment, but I look back to when Paul and I worked together on the 2017 tax cuts. The numbers were smaller. It was $1.5 trillion at the time, and we were saying the same thing. We were saying that if we can grow the economy at 3% instead of 2%, we will have a surplus, and we will begin to pay down the debt. Now, at the time, debt to GDP was close to 100%. We're closer to 125%. So I think we're in a much more difficult situation. We were also in a low interest rate environment. We're in a higher interest rate environment now. But I think it is critical that we begin to lower these leverage ratios. And I do look back at COVID, and COVID was obviously just an extraordinary situation where we shut down the economy. And I think the first $2 trillion we needed to spend, or we would have had a depression, not worldwide recession. But then the ongoing spending, and part of the problem was this normalized $1 trillion spending is a problem. And then lastly, I would just say, I do think Elon and Doge coming in, and we'll see where they end up, but the president appears to be interested in cutting government spending. So if we can have some government spending and some additional growth, I think we can get a path that's on the right track, but there's a lot of work to do because, as you said, we're starting from a 6% number.
Speaker Ryan, building on that, in terms of if there is an aspiration in this administration to have spending cuts that materially move these numbers, it seems to me the president has circumscribed a lot of that. He doesn't want to cut Medicare or Social Security. There's an ongoing political fight over Medicaid, but seems to be they're trying to keep it in the waste box, and then there's an argument over what's really waste. But we're probably not looking at the sort of deep Medicaid cuts that certain conservatives in the House might want. They want to spend more on the military. They can't affect the spending on interest, and interest rates have gone up. I can't look at that budget math and say that I see a way. It looks to me like, if anything, there's not going to be significant spending savings here out of this administration.
You're looking at about 10% of the budget they want to cut by 22% in their current budget. So domestic discretionary spending, there's an appetite to cut that. I think the budget that just came out yesterday proposes like a 22.6% cut to that, but that's about it. If you look at the current reconciliation bill, it has spending in it. It's got $300 billion in spending for DOD and for immigration and border stuff. So the 880 that Commerce Committee is trying to get out of Medicaid, we'll see. They're having a hard time putting the votes together for that. But this Congress isn't what we used to be. I don't think either of the two political parties, frankly, have any real appetite for entitlement reform, which is where the money is. So when you're looking at, 3/4 of the budget is in mandatory spending, put your interests aside, it's the mandatory entitlement programs which is driving this debt. And both parties have been sort of more or less taken over by populism, which stands against doing something about that. It wasn't too long ago we would actually make these proposals and pass these bills, but that is just not where we are. So I just do not see an appetite in Congress today or in the White House today to go after the big drivers of our debt, which is the mandatory spending.
And then, while I continue doing the rain cloud bit before we start talking about possible solutions, Alan, one silver lining that one would normally look for in a situation like this, where we're having this economic turmoil, is that normally you expect when there's some sort of crisis that there's flight to quality, and that drives lower interest rates on government debt and maybe a stronger dollar. And we're really seeing the opposite of that right now. Can you help us make sense of why are the financial markets reacting in this direction, and what should we expect in terms of, are we going to get any help on those interest costs, or are we actually just going to see more headwinds there?
Right. Well, we've got to define what flight to quality means, right? And so I think what people have been missing is that we've been very comfortable that everybody looks at the dollar as being the strength in the global economy. But foreign central banks have not been feeling that for a number of years. And so I believe that the underlying foundation of the dollar and Treasury market has been eroding over the last number of years, and we better pay attention to it pretty soon. So the easiest sign of that for me to see, there's two things out there. One, over decades, bottom line is gold would go up in periods whenever real interest rates went down. And they just correlated. The real interest rates go down, gold goes up. Real interest rates goes up, gold goes down. It was a very, very careful thing. Over the last, I'm going to guess 3 or 4 years, we've had a rise in real interest rates and a rise in gold to record highs. And now think about where gold might be if speculation wasn't allowed to move over to Bitcoin at the same time. So even with that, gold has gone up to record highs. Less speculation and more of it driven, in my belief, because foreign central banks have been moving more of their reserves, even in a period of a strong dollar and high real interest rates, into gold and out of dollars. what they're sort of saying is, we know there is no alternative right now to the dollar, but we have to start hedging because we don't know how long we can rely on the dollar being the safety. And then one other thing that we're seeing, if you look at, getting geeky, the SWIFT payment system, all transactions amongst countries went through SWIFT, right? All of a sudden in the last year or two, we're seeing China and some bilateral and now multilateral agreements to trade through another system that allows them to transact in different currencies through a system that is an alternative to SWIFT. And if you think about it, they say we're trying to move further and further away from reliance on the dollar for everything we do. So the main point about that is we should not sit here and think that we've got a lot of years to figure out what we're going to do about this deficit, because at some point the markets are saying we're going to have to hedge against the dollar and it's no longer the safe place to go.
Maya, the thing that strikes me about all of this is this is the situation we're describing before the acute crisis. I mean, like, these 6% of GDP budget deficits are not a deficit that is arising because of a recession. This is the budget deficit before we might be on the cusp.
These are the good times.
Right,
yeah.
exactly.
Yeah.
And then similarly, this distress, you know, that makes that adds these additional risks if the government is going to have to go out and borrow in a more intense way. That is again coming at a time when we should be in a position of strength. When you look back, you know, over the decades, you know, your efforts in Washington to get people to focus on this problem, this feels like, I mean, this isn't the worst fiscal position that we've ever been in the last 30 years, but it's the worst, it feels like the worst combination of fiscal position and political capacity to do anything about the fiscal position. It should be a relatively good time, and it's not.
Yeah, let me drill down on some of the bad news that the other panelists have shared, because one of the reasons you want fiscal responsibility is to be ready when the bad times come along. And we're not in one. We're in a good time, and yet all the warning lights are blinking really loudly. The fiscal situation itself, like Phil was talking about, terrible. Our debt in 4 years as a share of GDP is going to be the record. Last time that happened, it was set right after World War II. If we do nothing else, we're going to borrow like $22 trillion over the decade. Interest payments are the single fastest growing item in the budget, and the deficit is the highest it's ever been in a non-emergency period. Oh, and Social Security and Medicare are both going to become insolvent in roughly a decade, and we have a bunch of politicians promising not to fix them. So it's a terrible situation. And it's a terrible political environment. I really miss the days when Paul Ryan was in Washington actually talking about this issue and showing people you could talk about reality. But we've spent the past decade only talking about fiscal myths, like, don't worry, everything pays for itself. No, it doesn't. Don't worry, MMT, you can just print more money. It's a terrible idea, and because everybody's running away from the actual choices of budgeting. I think what the Secretary laid out of a 3% target of GDP is exactly right. Exactly the right target. That would take about $7.5 trillion in savings over the next 10 years. And just for perspective, the only deficit reducing action we've taken in the past decade was the Fiscal Responsibility Act, and that saved about $1.5 trillion. So this will be many times more. And to end on like what I think is the worst of all of these parts, our political environment is absolutely crummy for doing this, because we have people who run on promising not to do anything real. They aren't on the level about what it's going to take. We're going to have to do very structural entitlement reform because we've waited until the last minute. We're going to need new revenues. They don't have to be stupid. I mean, the corporate rate should stay low, individual rates should stay low, but we spend over $20 trillion through the tax code over a decade in tax expenditures. We need to broaden that base. But we're so polarized, our two parties are in the midst of like a cage match over who can pander more and give away more. So you don't really have this discussion in Washington at all these days. And I think it makes us incredibly vulnerable.
Paul, did you have?
Yeah, I was just going to say, unfortunately, everything Mia is saying is correct. What's frustrating as recovering politicians is we were more serious before, and we have relapsed on our seriousness of dealing with this. And what's frustrating about this especially is all of these problems are within our control as our own country. We see this coming. We know what we need to do. We could fix this, but we won't, or we're not. And it's because our political situation has deteriorated even more. Just to give you a sense of this, before I was Speaker in Ways and Means Chair, I chaired the Budget Committee. 10 years ago, I passed a budget off the House floor with 231 votes that cut $6.4 trillion out of the baseline. We raised the retirement age. We means tested Medicare. We block rented Medicaid. We did food stamp able-bodied work requirements, et cetera, et cetera. If you took that budget on today's baseline, we'd be cutting $11.6 trillion out of the baseline. 10 years ago, we had the votes for that. 10 years ago, we passed that off the House floor. They'll be lucky if they can get $2 trillion in this reconciliation bill out of this baseline. By the way, that won't be net $2 trillion because the $300 billion spending.
Still add 2.8
it'll be
trillion to the
1.7
debt.
if you're lucky. So the problem is we have just deteriorated, fiscally with the ability to take these things on. So that's what's frustrating about this is the most predictable economic crisis we've ever seen in our country. We know Treasury auctions may fail. We just don't know when. And we know what the Fed will do when that happens. And the guys like this probably know what it's going to look like when it happens. And we could avoid this, but it doesn't look like we're going to. That's what's so frustrating about this.
I do want to flag for the audience, there's a QR code that we'll bring up. If you have questions that you'd like to ask the panelists, you can scan the QR code, which they will put up there any moment. And then you can type in your question. It will appear on the iPad that I'm holding here, and we'll take some of those audience questions as we get into that. One thing I wonder about, given what Maya and Paul have described here, is you have this political situation where there's no desire to take this on. And we have these warnings of long-run risks if we fail to do that. And it makes me wonder, what is the forcing mechanism here? Because, I mean, the U.S. has done fiscal adjustments in the past. In 2011, there was a major agreement with under President Obama when you and...
did a deal with Petty Murray.
Right. Yeah. And then there in 1993 and 1990 and with the Greenspan Commission in the 80s, we used to do this. People used to look at it and say, there's this big gap, and they'd get together and come to fix it. So what has to change for that to happen? Does anyone have ideas about what forces might bring that to bear in Washington?
Well, I would say there's a couple of different things. So, let's just take Social Security, and it's obviously very difficult for any politician to say that they're going to cut Social Security benefits. Having said that, as Treasury Secretary, I had to sign off on a Social Security report every year.
Right.
So there's a date. We know the date that Social Security will run out of money. And this is effectively an off-balance sheet liability. So at some point in the near future, we need to have a bipartisan solution what we do for Social Security, since neither party is going to want Social Security to run out of money. I think, healthcare costs, look, I'm optimistic that with AI and other technology, we'll have savings in healthcare costs, which are a big component of this. As it relates to the Treasury auctions, it's unfortunately not quite as simple as the Fed stepping in and buying a failed auction. The Fed technically can't do that. We're also in an environment where the Fed is downsizing the portfolio and not increasing, which puts additional pressure. So, I think step one is the administration has to get through the things they're doing that they want the economic plan, which is tax cuts, regulatory relief, and their trade agenda. And then I'm hopeful that later on in this term, that there can be a bipartisan focus on costs. Some of that can be done now through the Republicans controlling the House, the Senate, and the presidency, and putting in savings and reconciliation. I had suggested on the tariff front, if you want to have a 10% tariff across the board, score it, put it in, and you can use that as savings. If you want to downsize certain of the expenses, and there are limitations, but there are clearly government expenses that can be cut and can be booked. But I agree with Paul. Ultimately, you have to deal with the other side of the income statement and the spending, not just the...
Alan?
Just a real quick point. I think one of the things, if you look at the financial crisis, which I read about, but you look at the financial crisis, consumers through that bit said, you know, I can take on a lot more debt on my house as long as my monthly payment is lower. And basically the government took over from consumers since then. And with the big decline in interest rates, one of the things that's allowed this to keep going on, my opinion, is everybody looks at their current monthly payment. So we went, rough numbers, 17 years where interest expense has been flat. And it was flat because you paid off 8% with 6% with 4%. All of that higher coupon debt's been paid off. So we had flat interest expense while we tripled our debt. Now, as we go forward, if interest rates stay around where they're supposed to be, our current interest expense is going to keep going up. And if by chance we have to let interest rates go higher, that squeeze on what the interest expense is going to start to be, as opposed to just the spending itself, could be a catalyst to get people in the room.
Phil, can we put some numbers to a couple of those things? First, the Social Security trust fund exhaustion. And so I guess as a legal matter, when the trust fund runs out of money, the government is only allowed to send out a fractional percentage of the Social Security. And so I think as a political matter, people expect that isn't what would happen. There would be some sort of patch, but that you get people to the table, they have to pass the patch, and then you can argue over what terms to have in it. And so when are we looking at for that to happen?
Right. So that's right. That when the trust fund is exhausted, the system becomes effectively a cash system. And that we have that as 2033, and benefit reductions would be about 25% to start, go up a little bit from there. So that I agree that's kind of the obvious driving factor. You know, the thing that's creeping up are interest payments and the net interest outlays. And Alan, it is exactly like Alan said. And there's a sense which that's probably crowding out other priorities, that as members, whatever they want to do is tax relief or more national security spending or homeland security spending, whatever it is, those interest payments are, in some sense, crowding out those other things.
Maya, I want to ask you about the interest rates, because I see this as a possible political forcing mechanism. I actually really like to look back at the 1992 campaign, because that I think was the last presidential campaign that really had deficit reduction as an issue at the forefront, with all three candidates pressing the idea that they were going to do that. And the focus there on why individuals should care about the deficit was there was this idea that when the government borrows too much money, that makes it expensive for you to borrow money. It makes it expensive for you to get a mortgage. Companies can't get financing to invest. Is that a connection that can start being drawn for people again? Because we went through this long period with interest rates so low, they weren't really central in our politics. But I don't really see politicians making that argument yet about we need lower budget deficits so that your mortgage rate can be lower.
Yeah. Yeah, in fact, the era of low interest rates made this so much more complicated, and we even had people saying, look, interest rates are so low, borrowing is basically free, we should borrow more. And you don't have to say that twice for a politician to be like, okay, that seems like a pretty good plan. So we borrowed incredible amounts beyond just COVID. I do think the increase in interest rates is already being felt. I think people in the markets, financial people, are talking about this and feeling this much more than they were just a few years ago. One thing you'll hear from folks in Washington is, no one cares about this issue. I don't hear from anybody that it matters to them. But they are starting to a little bit. And folks who understand markets are saying what happened with treasuries was quite alarming. And to watch that with stocks, the dollar, and bonds all at once was a big warning to us. The way that this is going to change is one of two models. It's either going to be out of crisis or leadership. And the crisis almost certainly will come from something in the bond market, or if there is a big emergency, where usually when we borrow during an emergency, our rates stay low. But if we are out of fiscal space and a next emergency comes, our borrowing will be much more difficult. That will be the kind of warning sign. Leadership also happened in the 90s in an odd package of Ross Perot, right? You had somebody who wrestled this issue onto the agenda and forced the politicians who didn't want to talk about it to talk about it. So in my weird fiscal circles, we spend a lot of time saying, how do you create like a pseudo-crisis that would just nudge people enough to start taking this seriously and think about what you would do ahead of time, like build a break-the-glass plan so you're ready instead of waiting to the stupid self-inflicted crisis of waiting till the last moment.
I want to turn to the revenue side in a second, but to stay on spending cuts for a moment. if we're talking about, quote unquote entitlement reform, is this just the usual menu of options? You can raise the retirement age, you can adjust benefit formulas. It's basically that, you either have some sort of, you could cut across the board, you can do something that tries to make it more progressive with some sort of means testing. But is that what the political proposition has to be, that basically benefits, especially old age benefits, will simply be less generous in the future?
Yeah, I would say we've learned a lot about how to run retirement systems and healthcare systems since we started these programs in 1932 and 1965. So there's a lot more we know. In Medicare's example, the federal employee health benefit system is a very popular system that works well, that has far lower cost increases than current Medicare. So we have roadmaps on what to emulate to bring good reforms. And for the scorekeepers, if you do something like that, you're effectively taking a program that is now a defined benefit, open-ended program, and putting a fixed growth rate on it, and basically turning it into a defined contribution program. And then you're underneath that doing things like you just described, raising the retirement age, means testing the benefit, subsidizing a person's premium based on health and wealth. That model works. They score it pretty well, and it gets you out of the woods. But it is a combination of newer things we've learned in society about how better to run these programs using private sector choice and competition, along with those sort of austere, screw-turning things. The good thing about all of this is, if we step ahead of this, we don't have to do it to current seniors. It can be prospective. So anybody who is in or near retirement today won't have this apply to them. It will be to tomorrow's retirees. Let's just take, before when we did it, it was 55 and below. I don't think we had the physical space for that. Let's just say 60 and below. So at least you have a little bit of time to prepare. And politically, you can survive it because you're not taking it away from current seniors. We wait till we get a really bad situation, we may not be able to do that. If we're doing urgent budget surgery to dodge the vigilantes in the bond markets, we may not be able to do that. So the last thing I'd say is, I think the only game in town right now is a fiscal commission with teeth. I was on Bull Simpson. Bull Simpson was literally dead before we left the room in the last meeting because the President of the United States and the Speaker of the House at the time put out press releases saying, we're not doing it, and therefore they didn't. So a fiscal commission with teeth like the Greenspan 84 Commission on Social Security that requires Congress to vote on it, not amend it, not filibuster it, and then, maybe a president in his, in his last term, second half of the last term, looking for a legacy, save the dollar, dodge a debt crisis, could do that. But to Steve's point, it has to be bipartisan. And the linchpin is a debt limit deal, some fiscal deal where you have a tight Congress, and that is the price of getting that package passed, which is requiring a statutory commission to bring to Congress something like that.
Phil, you had your hand up.
No, I certainly agree with everything. I was just thinking about your original question, is that entitlement reform doesn't have to be only austerity, right? I mean, you can make the system more progressive by increasing benefits at the bottom.
Yep.
And decreasing benefits, net benefits at the top, whether with revenues or with spending,
Right.
Because the system is progressive now, but the benefits for people at the bottom in terms of dollars are really quite meager. And that's just what Paul means, but we've learned a lot that it's a safety net, and maybe the bottom of the safety net just isn't as strong as it could be.
That's true as a theoretical matter, but I think back to what's actually happening in this political environment. One of the president's key proposals around Social Security is to exempt Social Security benefits from taxes. That is effectively a benefit increase for the upper end of the scale, because lower income people don't pay tax.
And that revenue finances Medicare and Social Security, so you're actually cutting those programs if you actually took that revenue stream away.
Right. So, and then we also, one of the few examples of Congress working together in a bipartisan manner effectively recently was to increase Social Security benefits. They passed a law. There's a Byzantine system for if you're spent part of your career as a government employee, not in Social Security, and some people had some reasonable fairness complaints, and instead of tweaking the system, they just basically threw a whole bunch of money at all of these people. So, in theory, that could be done, but the idea that Donald Trump would want, his last lame duck period to be doing this horrible thing that everyone in Washington hates to try to do, in defense of a dollar, which it doesn't even seem to me that the administration is sure that it wants a strong dollar. So I just, I see the theory here. I have a very grim feeling about the likelihood of that actually
I
materializing.
didn't say it was a great answer. That was the best answer I had for you.
But we do have to start telling the truth about Social Security.
Right.
Right.
Like, it is not rocket science how to fix it. It's a bunch of moderately difficult choices. One of the benefits is many young people think they're not going to get it anyhow. So by just giving them partial benefits, they are getting above what they think they would get. But if we just go along and then we hit the trust fund, we run out of money, and we start plowing general revenues into it, just remember, our budget, we already give $6 to a senior for every one we give to people under 18. So we are making a choice then to increase the share of our budget that's going to seniors at a time where there are huge needs in terms of whatever it is for security, cybersecurity, investments, competition, energy, human capital. Like, take your priority. It's unlikely to be wealthy seniors' pensions. And that would be the thing that we are making a choice to put trillions of dollars more in. So we can't, and by the way, in that thing you just mentioned, WEP-GPO, one of the unions leaked my phone number to the seniors about protesting this. And so I know they're very, very scary. I would never want to be a politician who had to go against the ARP or other groups.
Right.
But we have to tell the truth that this program, we are continuing to make promises that we can't keep, and putting all the resources in there takes them from something else that's arguably a higher priority.
I want to make a comment on the dollar, because now that I'm no longer the Treasury Secretary, I can comment on these things.
Yes, please.
I believe that the administration understands the importance of the dollar being the reserve currency. And I think for the foreseeable future, notwithstanding there may be some central banks that move into gold, those are on a relative basis.
No, there's no
not
alternative.
Massive
It's just a hedge.
numbers. There really is no alternative currency. So I think the good news is for the foreseeable future, we will be the reserve currency. We couldn't finance these deficits if we weren't the reserve currency. And I think with that comes a level of responsibility, because we are the reserve currency of the world, but also comes a level of benefits. On the SWIFT issue, the reason why people are trying to get away from SWIFT is because of sanctions. And, you know, again, our sanctions, because they're reserve currency, are a very important foreign policy tool. So I think we always wanted a stable dollar. We didn't want a weak dollar. We also didn't want a dollar that was too strong over time. But it is in our interest to have a stable dollar, and it is very important for us to keep the dollar as the reserve currency of the world. Because if people don't view that, then we're going to have an even bigger problem financing our debt.
So I just one more thing to Steve, and then Paul, I'll go to you. Do you think that a desire to maintain the dollar as the reserve currency and to have a stable dollar, is that consistent with the administration's stated desire to achieve this sort of rebalancing in the global economic system? I mean, they seem to want to discourage other countries from holding U.S. Treasury bonds.
No, I don't believe that at all. I think that they absolutely understand that.
Okay.
And I think, by the way, on trade, I mean, a lot of these issues were in Trump 1.0. They're just stronger. But I mean, I go back to when President Trump's been talking about trade way before he was president. During the first term, the economic plan was tax cuts, regulatory relief, and trade. And if we look at China trade, just as an example, there's no question that, you know, administrations on both parties for a long period of time had a China policy. The more we open up to them, the more they'll become like us. They didn't. And we ended up with these big trade deficits because our markets were open to them and their markets weren't open to us. So I think to the extent the tariffs are being used to create a fair and level trading pattern, that's something that is a good thing, and I know is the president's objective.
Sorry, Paul, I cut you off.
On the good news front, I think Congress is going to pass the stablecoin legislation this summer, and that is going to help spread the dollar more widely across the world. It's going to digitize the dollar, and I think it's going to help us buttress the dollar as the global reserve currency. So I think we've got good news also coming on the dollar front.
Can we turn and talk about the revenue side? We've talked about ways to cut spending. Do we need tax increases as part of this rebalancing?
We don't. And if we look at corporate taxes, you know, and everybody criticized us the first time around, we cut corporate taxes and corporate revenues went way up. And we simplified the tax code in certain aspects, but we need growth.
We need growth.
We need to get to 3% and not 2%, and we need a tax policy things like expensing, which are very pro-growth, that get us to that point.
But then
I'll take the other side of this.
Yeah, go
if I
ahead.
may. And I agree on the corporate tax rate completely. That is not the place where you want to get revenue. But there's 2 points I would make. One, if you look at the current reconciliation bill, which they're talking about, take the House version of it, they are assuming growth of about $2.6 trillion out of their entire package. Outside estimators, the range is negative 50 billion to 700 billion. So they have an estimate that's many, many multiples above. Part of the reason is the most pro-growth tax cuts are already permanent. The ones that they're extending are much less pro-growth. But so they're assuming a much larger multiple than is credible. But the second thing I would say is we have the chance right now to cut spending. There is a reconciliation bill out there. The Senate has put on the table something where they would borrow $4.8 trillion, and they're asking themselves to save $2 trillion. Now, keep in mind, spending over the 10-year period is going to be $86 trillion. And an all-Republican House, Senate, and President is asking for $2 trillion. But the Senate didn't like that bill. They said, no, not $2 trillion. We're going to just shoot for $4 billion. $4 billion out of $86 trillion. So the problem that I'm seeing is that no one actually has the courage of their convictions when it comes to the hard things. They don't actually want to cut government spending, and Democrats don't really want to raise revenue except on millionaires and billionaires, 2% of people.
Yeah.
And so we have an issue where I don't think there's any conceivable way where you can get to that $7.5 trillion in savings from spending alone. So I think you have to look at the revenue side, which would do the least damage to growth. And again, I would go into our terrible tax base that's filled with these tax expenditures that are honestly just spending programs hidden through the tax code.
Alan?
Yeah, there's a number of things to just cover. One quick one on Bol Simpson. I agree with Paul, and I know that's when Maya and I first met. I tried to go to the Obama administration and say, the way you should do Bol Simpson is put it out there and then give Congress 6 months, which has happened before in bills, say, I'll give you 6 months to come up with something you like better that's bipartisan. If not, this becomes law. And that's what I think, not looking to this administration necessarily, but if we run into a problem with the dollar, I'd like to see a bipartisan group come together and say, unless we get in a room and not just argue that, no, we need less this and you need more that, we're never going to get it done. But I happen to believe that we do need more revenue. And growth is not the total answer. I'm a Jack Kemp aficionado like Paul, but we go through how many years of saying, okay, we'll grow our way out. Corporate taxes are a whole different thing. They're not really the place to tax. But the reality is of saying we have 16 to 18% of our GDP in revenue, and we have 23 to 25%. We're going to cure it all from up there is just not realistic. And so something we've talked about, demographics, which to me are the future that's already happened. You hear about them for so long that it seems like no big deal. We not only, everybody's aware of the demographic impact of senior citizens now growing rapidly and what we owe them. We're not aware of the fact that we now have a declining working age population that is significant. So that we used to have 5 18 to 64-year-olds for every 65 and over. We now have 3.5, and we're on our way to 2 3/4. So the main way we tax is through wages, right, and earnings. That's the main, 80% of our tax revenue comes from that. So if we're going to turn around and say this smaller and smaller percentage of the population is going to have to come up with 80 or 90% of our revenue, we're kidding ourselves. We're not looking forward. So I think people know here, I have said, yes, we have to change Social Security. We have to make the adjustments, everything else. But when you really get into means testing and stuff, it gets very, very tough to prove and get. So I have believed for a long time that we are the only country in the OECD that does not have a VAT. And a VAT is, quote, a consumption tax, although it's not entirely. And I say, if you want to really means test retirees, they spend a lot if they have a lot of money. And therefore, most of that revenue will come from there. You can turn around and give more benefits to the people at the lower end because it's, quote, regressive. So we have to think about, get in a room and think about the new ways we look at both revenue and spending instead of sitting on two sides of the aisle, say, get the revenue from the rich or get the spending and that's all. So I think we got to look at both.
Phil, you...
Oh, no, I was I agree with everything. Everything has been said, and just to expand on the challenge here, it's in some ways the 2017 Act was very thoughtful, right? As was said just a minute ago, the pro-growth parts are permanent, right? The corporate rate is permanent, and the international tax provisions that increased U.S. competitiveness are permanent. And then there are a bunch of base broadeners, right? The indexation of the tax brackets, the mandate in the ACA.
SALT.
SALT. There are other instances, the repatriation. And so that, in some sense, offsets some of the drag from the deficit. And it's just hard to do that again because the really pro-growth stuff is permanent already. That means you can't extend it. And so, the individual rates there's some pro-growth incentives there, labor supply, but it's just not as sort of high-powered as what was made permanent, and that's the challenge.
But isn't the flip side of that the economic damage from increases on the individual side are not as pronounced? I mean, the corporate income tax base is on the order of 10% of GDP, and that's where you get the biggest bang for your buck in terms of economic growth, but through both cuts and restructuring. It seems like we ought to be able to get both the growth and the revenue thing by a shift in where the base is. I mean, whether a VAT or even an increase in the payroll tax, there are ways that you could raise the revenue that have a much smaller impact on GDP than if you wanted to raise the corporate rate back to 35.
Can I make another point on the growth?
Yes, and then Paul.
Do you want to answer that?
No, go ahead. You go first, then I'll go to you.
Well, it was the similar thing, which is we're actually also getting to the point where so if you cut taxes, the dollar of additional debt is close to doing more damage to the economy than the dollar of growth from the tax cut, depending on which tax cut it is. So we have to be really careful to do what you're saying, which is cut the most pro-growth taxes and raise the least pro-growth increases.
Yeah, that's a decent trade. You're not going to get that in this moment, but when we wrote that bill intentionally, keeping the business stuff permanent, Steve and I, we were the designers of this because we knew that needed to be permanent for business planning and certainty, et cetera, et cetera. The challenge on the individual side of it is most of our businesses aren't C Corps, they're pass-throughs. Right. And they file individual taxes. If you're an LLC or a sole proprietor or subchapter S corporation, you're filing as a person. That's like 80% of American businesses. And what we did not want to do is drop C Corps to 21 and keep the S Corps up at 44.6% effectively, which would have happened had we not done that. So we dropped their rate correspondingly, and that goes back up. So there is some pro-growth or anti-growth tax policy over here on the individual side that's expiring that we don't want to let expire because it will really do a lot of damage to a lot of businesses. And then as Steve mentioned, the expensing stuff, that's really the biggest kicker for growth in this bill. I think everybody would agree on that. That's in this thing too. So there's pro-growth stuff, there's collateral damage if you don't get this done to growth.
Right, and not only do we lower the top rate, but we added the pass-through deduction.
Exactly, 199A we call it.
Which is critical.
But Alan? But last thing I was going to say, tax reform can fix this. You can get a broader base at higher revenues and still maximize economic growth through a reformed tax code that is more consumption-based by exempting savings and investment from taxation, effectively taxing consumptions. There are different ways of skinning that cat. You could do what Alan's saying. You could do an X tax, a cash flow tax. We've talked about our border adjustment tax. Wouldn't that be nice versus tariffs these days? I digress. So, but I think you can get to that maybe 20% of GDP revenue line, not 24 or 5.
I agree.
But not with this code. That's the challenge.
But I want to push back on one thing, Paul, because I was pushing back on this when you guys were doing your bill. I agree you want to be fair to pass-throughs versus C Corps, but the only reason pass-throughs exist is because people that own their own business and then were taking home their profits didn't want to pay a corporate tax and then pay a tax on dividends. So they weren't being double taxed. So the reason that you had the pass-through was to say, okay, pay your personal tax rate, that's one time. Now all of a sudden you say, if I'm going to bring the corporate rate down to here, I'm going to still only tax you once, and you're going to get a C Corp rate, but then those that are getting dividends out of C Corps are going to have to pay a tax again. So I lobbied against it. The funny thing was I said, look, I'm an LLC, so I'll benefit, but I still don't think. And then they went ahead and said, oh, sorry, investment banks and,
you guys
law
got exempt.
Couldn't do it. So I said, okay, so, you knocked me out. But I do think we have to think those things through as to, I said, why not give businesses the opportunity to either pay the corporate rate and then go ahead and pay taxes on distributions or be your pass-through. But by giving them both, I think those are the kinds of things that I personally think we have to think through.
We made a run at it in the Bush administration to get rid of the tax on dividends, and we came up short.
Right, but I'm just saying that
Yeah.
one or the other, not both.
I want to take some questions that have come in from the audience. And again, if you have more questions you want to submit, we'll put that QR code up again, and you can send them in. We have one question about the IRS. If the government's revenue model is almost completely based on taxing income, why do we refuse to invest as much as possible in the IRS? And so, of course, what's been in the news is there's a huge headcount reduction ongoing at the IRS from about 100,000 employees, the ballpark of 65 or 70,000 employees, and that's below. There was a big increase in headcount, but this is a larger decrease than the prior increase. It would be.
Let me comment on that one, okay? And this goes back to, I can tell you 8 years ago, the IRS needed more money for technology. And Paul remembers this.
Yes.
Kind of one of the things I said, it's critical. We have to use technology. We don't need more bodies. The technology was in the Stone Ages and needs to be upgraded. The reason why the Biden administration added all these people to the IRS is there's a way that these things are scored, and if you add more people, you assume you'll collect more taxes, and you can put it through reconciliation. So, I mean, I would argue, and maybe we shouldn't be downsizing it exactly the way we're doing it, but we didn't need all those people. What we needed was a long-term investment in technology to upgrade the IRS. And particularly with AI, there's ways of doing this today that are much more efficient than just throwing bodies at it.
But so you don't see, if we have 30% fewer revenue agents, fewer auditors, you don't think that that has an impact on?
No, I think that technology can replace people, and I think the motivation of adding all these people was when they were scoring this, they could count the revenue.
It's a tax gap score. It's a gimmick.
I agree with
Phil,
Steve. I agree with Steve, but I'll tell you one thing.
Yeah.
The headlines about getting rid of everybody, I swear to God, I've heard this a few times. My wife's hairdresser said, "Isn't it great? We don't have to file our taxes." And there's a bunch of people that are now saying that. And without the technology, it's really just funny that people are going, "This is great. We don't have to pay taxes."
Well, they're going to repeal the tax on tips anyway, so he actually isn't going to have to pay taxes. Phil, I think this is probably not something that you loved having to deal with, but that you were doing that score, and I remember you came under criticism from Democrats that the score wasn't big enough, that you had underestimated the amount of revenue that would come from this. What's your view on how these changes at the IRS affect revenue?
Yeah, that was a highlight of my first term at CBO. I think it was a deputy White House press secretary criticizing me. Like, it was some line like CBO doesn't know anything about the IRS, and of course, all of our people doing it were former Treasury people. So, we do that cost estimate. We tried to get information from the Biden administration Treasury about, okay, you're going to get this money. If you get it, what will you use it on? And it was, very general. They said technology, so they, such as they have that in their heads, but we couldn't get information on, well, exactly what are you going to do? So our cost estimate, our score for those resources is very general, and we assumed they're going to do like the highest ROI things first and then go down, but it's based on these historical studies, and we just could not get them to say, well, exactly what are you going to do? And that was just what am I supposed to do if they won't tell us what their plans are?
We have a question about population growth. And basically, is there a role for more population growth, more immigration, a higher birth rate? I mean, obviously, those are both long-run things, and the birth rate especially is not proven especially amenable to policy influence. Is there anything we can do to control our destiny there in terms of this, the math that feeds into the budget?
I would ask Phil Swagel a question. If I'm not mistaken, your long-term model says we're going to grow at about 1.3% over the next 30 years, almost solely because of the lack of population growth. And if we change our immigration laws and brought in working-age populations in a work-based system in such a way that doesn't depress people's wages, which you can do with today's technology, their model gets you up in growth. I don't know if you can get to 3%, but
it can.
But my question is, we could get with let's just say we do entitlement reform, and we saved the dollar and prevent a debt crisis, the only other thing we really got to do to get to 3% growth is this, right?
Skills. Yeah, yeah. And it's something we've enhanced our modeling to do that. We have a lot of modeling in immigration.
So you could reconcile it, correct?
Yes, we now can take into account, well, what are the characteristics of the immigrants? Are the people with relatively low education or higher education? And there's a bigger growth impact from higher education. And there's no normative view there.
But these are scoreable savings now,
These
correct?
are, we would, it would be part of a dynamic score. We would do that.
There's one other thing. Just it really, people, it's overhyped right now. But if growth is hours times productivity, there's two ways you can get more growth. It's either hours or productivity, right? And if we invest the right way, and we really have private partnerships, et cetera, to build out the infrastructure that some of these AI can ride on, we actually could get a situation that sounds the opposite, where people are afraid of, but we could use. You could get a big productivity kick on the investment over the infrastructure that we could build out. Look, China now has dark factories, building cars without one person in the factory. Now that sounds terrible right now. You say, we don't want to replace all those jobs, but if you have fewer people, but you actually kick up the productivity that way, you can actually get the growth that you need and distribute in ways to the people that are going to be supporting that. So we've got to think about, you know, one of the things I said when I became an economist, people said, would you have studied economics? I said, no, I would have studied history, because you got to look back and say, it's not just the period we've been in. What are the secular things that we have to look at? And if we would think more about the infrastructure build out around the productivity boom, it could be a big game changer.
We have several questions about a sovereign wealth fund, and there's been some talk about this in the administration. Sovereign wealth funds are for countries with lots of oil, and budget surplus, right? Is there any role here for a sovereign wealth fund? Do you have a sense, Steve, of are they serious about that?
I think the answer is there can be.
Okay.
I mean, there can be strategic investments that it makes sense for the U.S. to do. And in that sense, the sovereign wealth fund could have a role. Now, in a way, we do have a sovereign wealth fund. It's called Social Security. Had we invested Social Security in the S&P a long time ago, as opposed to investing it in our own bonds, we wouldn't have a problem with Social Security today. So, I mean, I think, and this is what, Paul said, if we can get rid of kind of, defined benefit plans and convert them into defined contribution plans, then there is a role for potentially a sovereign wealth fund to manage that money.
I just want to sort of...
But our sovereign wealth fund would still be financed all from borrowing. So it's not even really a sovereign wealth fund. It's just borrowing.
We have a sovereign wealth fund. It's called the Fed. Quantitative,
right? I mean,
quantitative easing is
you
basically...
You can make arguments. There's lots of good uses for the resources, but it would still just be borrowing.
Well, it wouldn't be the equivalent of a sovereign wealth fund that other countries have when they have limited resources and their objective is to transform the economy.
Yeah.
So there could be a role. It's not synonymous with exactly what every other one is.
Good point.
I just want to review some of the things that we've discussed here in terms of, things that would be part of the way out of the woods. We're supposed to cut Social Security, probably with a retirement age increase. You might have some increase in progressivity, so instead of things like eliminating taxes on Social Security benefits, you would be reducing benefits for higher income seniors. We're maybe going to have more immigration. Alan wants a VAT. All of this is just politically awful. Like the absolute opposite of what people are discussing doing in Washington right now.
Well, let me go on the record. I don't like the VAT. So
okay.
I don't either. I don't like the VAT.
I thought Paul and I would agree on this.
You don't all have to.
And a lot of people think, kind of the reasons why Europe, amongst a bunch of other things, is it's very easy to just add a VAT and continue to tax and spend. I also think, and I just want to clarify, I think we need to fix Social Security. I don't think the headline should be, we're going to cut Social Security. Matter of fact, the headline has to be, we're not cutting Social Security benefits, at least for the majority of the population.
Oh, okay. Because, I mean, to save money, you have to cut something.
The game is always, we're never going to cut current seniors. We're going to do it. We're going to make changes for the next generation so that we can cash flow the program for current seniors and save it from insolvency and bankruptcy. Right. But what the politicians say, if I do that, and I raise retirement age in 10 years or taper the benefit formula for future generations, the ad against me is going to be I'm cutting current seniors and everybody's going to get confused and I'm going to lose. That's basically the political calculation. That's the problem. That's why these things got to be bipartisan.
I want to say one thing about the VAT these guys don't like. Larry Summers said a while ago on a panel we were on, you know, conservatives don't like a VAT because they say it's a spending machine. Then liberals don't like the VAT because they say it's regressive. Sooner or later, they're going to realize the other one is right.
Yeah, the problem for Republicans and conservatives is they want the revenue, but they don't want to give us the spending cuts. And so it's like we're just going to give you more revenue to feed this unsustainable spending trajectory. The only way a deal like this ever works is if you have them paired together, where you know you're getting
exactly
real
right.
spending changes, real actual changes to the spending baseline. Then and only then, I think, are conservatives willing to entertain.
Well, look, Paul, that's 100%. That's why
revenue.
I use the VAT as well. We need more revenue, period, full stop. And we need less spending, period, full stop. And if all we do is argue that the other one's got to get it done and then we'll be fine, we got to get in a room like a Bowles Simpson and say, okay, how can we come together and come up with something that we can all agree on is a way to bring this together? Because we just keep arguing it's your side versus that side. Because the one thing I want to say, something I totally agree with Steve, that there is no alternative to the dollar as a reserve currency, and that's really important. But the real question is, how much is it going to cost us to get the capital to be the reserve currency? Because if over time we get downgraded again in the US Treasuries, we can still be the reserve currency, but if our cost of capital is going like that, it's going to cause a dramatic impact on our economy. So we shouldn't just take that reserve currency for you know.
Can I address your question in
Yes.
that, I mean, we have to do something about this fiscal situation. At the moment, it is weakening our economy. It's weakening our ability to respond to emergencies. It's threatening our national security, and it could lead to a fiscal crisis when we would not be able to fix it on our own terms. We have to do something. I think the problem with your question is it's really unattractive what the solutions are. That's why we haven't been doing it for so long. That's why it's much more fun to be in the period where you're borrowing than you're fixing it. The bottom line, the truth is, the way you fix a fiscal imbalance is you cut spending and you raise taxes. And you try to do them in the best way you can.
Or you cut spending and you grow the economy.
You can do that, but, and you know, you both are talking about that, but again, the Republicans right now don't seem to want to cut any spending. Like, let's cut some spending. But they're not showing up to do it. And so I'm really worried about there being any willpower to do anything. And I think part of that is because we're out of practice of actually budgeting and making these choices. So the thing I would recommend is, like, we should start by passing budgets. We don't pass budgets. We haven't passed a serious budget in basically a decade. The ones we pass are only to unleash reconciliation. We should do that. We should bring in the 3% deficit goal, and anybody who puts forward a budget, it should have to meet that 3% deficit goal or something like that. We should stick with pay-as-you-go, which means you've got to offset these things. So let's do these tax cuts and let's offset them. Or if somebody wants to grow spending, you've got to figure out how. And finally, I think, like others have talked about, we will need a fiscal commission because we are so out of practice with making the hard choices. We will need something to give politicians the political cover to do the choices that there really is no avoiding at the end of the day. Those are the things we're going to have to do.
I think that's a good note that we can leave the panel on. I want to thank everybody for joining us today. Thank you.
It was good.